Welcome to another episode of CoLeaders for Africa. I'm your host, Meryem Najma Agadi, and today we have the pleasure of speaking with Egla Ntumba, co-founder and managing partner of MS Fit Ventures, a Pan-African debt fund supporting female and led SMEs across Africa. Egla has an inspiring career from venture capital to entrepreneurship and is on a mission to empower women in business. Egla, welcome. Let's start at the very beginning. What was your dream when you were younger, and what inspired your journey into the world of business and entrepreneurship?
Ooh, that's a really good question. Right at the beginning. My first dream that I can remember as a young girl was to be president. That's the first career I've always wanted. My parents sat me down and they were explaining to me the different jobs that people have in life. And I think I must have been maybe 6 or something. And I said, oh, I know, I want to be president. And then my dad said, politicians lie, so you can't be president. And I said, oh, okay, that makes sense. So I'm not going to be president. And then I decided, what's the next best thing? Managing money. And this was before the 2008 financial crisis, when being a banker was still in fashion. So I thought, ooh, bank manager. That's what I wanted to do. But this was in DRC, Central DRC. And that's what I decided I wanted to do. And there was also the reason I'd say Central Jersey is because there was a lot of entrepreneurship around me, and I think that was always sitting in the back of my mind, and that's what led me into entrepreneurship, but
Wow.
first into finance.
And
Yeah.
at MS Fit Ventures, you focused on providing support to women-led business across Africa. Why do you believe that women
Mm.
entrepreneurs are the key to unlocking Africa's economical potential? And how does your fund help address this gap?
Mm. So at Misfits, the reason why we even put the name is because myself and my co-founder Joel, we really found ourselves, being in this space where we were in venture capital, and we're seeing really interesting businesses that were outperforming their competitors, that were really strong executors. But because they were female led teams, they weren't performing as well as maybe some of the male led teams. So then that has always been a thing in the back of our minds. And I mean, if you look at the numbers, even just as early as last year, only 2% of venture capital funding went to women entrepreneurs. That's $48 million. 98% went to male founders, which is $2.2 billion went to male founders. These numbers are stark. They really just shift you out of whatever comfort position you're sitting in. You have to do something. And as I said before, I'm from DRC. If you've ever been to DRC, or even most African countries, South Africa is a bit different, but you see a lot of female, food merchants maybe selling vegetables on the table in the market or whatever, all the way to larger businesses. But what I experienced personally is that these entrepreneurs usually have these businesses, are able to raise their children, send their children to school, pay for all their bills, and have a good livelihood. But these businesses never go beyond that table in the corner of that market that that table is always there. I'm sure you all know of that one store that has always been there for years and years and years. It doesn't really grow beyond that. And that's the reason why I got involved in wanting to fund female entrepreneurs. That was my first and biggest driver. I just wanted female entrepreneurs to build these incredible industry leading businesses. And it took us almost 3 years to finally come up with Mr. Venture. We had been thinking about how can we support female entrepreneurs, And we did a lot of research. And then finally, we ended up on actually, let's provide them with working capital. And then let's provide them with a lot of hands on support, kind of partnership model where we help them grow their businesses. So that's kind of how I got to the point. That's how we're trying to solve that. Not just giving capital, because the first reason small businesses fail is access to capital. The second biggest reason is market access. So we're solving both of those problems by providing capital and lots of hands-on support and market access to our
Very,
entrepreneurs.
very interesting. Thank you for sharing those numbers because, of course, when we share numbers, it scares us, it opens our minds, it it shocks us
Yeah.
also somehow. And this is why we should also dig a little bit when we want to empower, when we want to build and to develop entrepreneurship into or across Africa, we should always go back to the data to be aware of what we have to do and what we need to do through the timeline. It will not change from the day to another day. I mean, there is a lot of work to do, so we have to also be aware of the process. And I was wondering, through your own process, what was your biggest challenges to be where you are today from where you start?
My biggest challenge in life. Goodness, this is a good question. Ooh, I think I was always from academics, right? That has always been easy for me. My biggest challenge in life was learning that sometimes things don't go as planned. So when you're going through the academic system, you study, you get a test, you do well in the test, everything is great. And then as soon as you come out of school, you expect that life will be in that same structure. You know, you prepare, you go to the thing, the interview, the application for funding or whatever, and everything is going to work exactly the way you had planned because that's how it works in school. And then my first time that I was faced with things not working out quite as I expected was when I was trying to leave my first job and really go into M&A for mergers and acquisitions or move into that kind of work. And it just felt like it was taking too long in my own mind. I had been applying for jobs for 3 months and I was like, wait a minute, why is this not working for me? At this time I had maybe 1 year of work experience out of university. And I was like, "Look, I have strong academics. I have this 1 year of experience. Surely I should get jobs." But it didn't go that way. It took me 3 months. I was like losing my mind because I never experienced delay or any kind of thing like that. And I really had to face myself and say, you know what? I think you're freaking out a little bit about nothing. But it wasn't that quick. I had conversations with a bunch of people who were like, Egla, relax. I was even speaking to my therapist at the time, and I was like, I've been applying for jobs, and I still haven't received an offer. I'm in shock. This is not okay. And then she asked me, she said, "How long have you been applying?" I said, 3 months. Can you believe this? And then she looked at me and she really tried to be gentle with me, but she's like, Igla, it's been 3 months. Relax. What is going on here? But I think that was a really pivotal moment for me to learn that things don't always go as you plan, and things work out just because it took 3 months. And maybe actually, I think it took 6 months in the end of just going through the application process with my 1 year of work experience. But in the end, it was okay. But that in between part where I was freaking out, I could really just save myself a lot of pain by just going with the process and enjoying where I was, you know? So, yeah, that was probably my biggest challenge in life. and learning. Mm, mm, yeah. Mm. That's a really interesting point. Also, maybe just to add there, people always ask me, you're in venture capital or you're in private credit, and it's a really very limited space. How are you navigating the space? And it always takes me a minute. I'm like, no, it's not. And then I realize it's because only about 13% of senior partners in venture capital funds are women. So very, very well dominated. But I always, whenever I enter into a new space, I surround myself with an army of female mentors. Always. Base case. So that point that you mentioned about mentorship is really, really true for me because I just always do that. And then I create this almost like unique little world around myself that whenever the reality of what's happening outside of my little universe are happening, I have a reference point that's different that shows me what I need to see in order to continue going. But anyway, we digress.
A reminder. I think so many people needs this reminder, needs to know that sometimes we need to ask for help, we need to ask for solutions, and to help us to move forward. Okay, so thank you again for this reminder, Egla, that show us the importance of uh, mentorship and to be surrounded with the right people to help us to move forward and to achieve our goals. And beyond your work today, that you are doing now with the MS Fit Ventures. You've also seen the business world through you work also in logistics, right? And trade finance and supply chain management. What are some of the exciting trends or innovations you've seen in Africa that could reshape industries here?
There are so many things. What I've seen with supply chain and logistics, maybe just to start from the beginning, is that Africa has about $100 billion annual infrastructure gap. And that's for new infrastructure. There's just really limited or no budget to build new infrastructure like roads and things like that. A second thing is even maintaining infrastructure that we have. So already from that base, it's a really, really difficult space to be operating in when we don't have roads or hospitals and things. Now, of course, the experience that you're talking to is my experience with the corporate venture capital funds, where we were investing in supply chain and logistics startups. And really, what we saw, or what I saw, is that specifically, maybe let me zoom into the warehouse automation space. There has been a boom in e-commerce, even since a little bit before the pandemic. But e-commerce has been growing quite steadily globally, but also in Africa. In order for something like e-commerce to take off, you need warehouses, right? Really basic and simple, because you need a place to put all the stuff, right? But in Africa, for example, we have very limited international grade warehouses where things can be stored safely and sort of connection points between the warehouses and maybe a distribution center and points of distribution with roads and things like that. So very limited infrastructure. So what I actually found is interesting, especially in Africa, is that it's not always the big innovation like a fully automated warehouse that's really really interesting and different, or like an AI warehouse management system. Like it's not always that stuff. Models that I found really interesting that I also saw were working in Latin America were models where, for example, some startups were using the idle space in someone's house and using that as a storage point closer to the end customers. So they would basically map, do a heat map of where are most of our customers, and then around those areas, they would find people whose homes maybe you have an extra bedroom. They would give you all of the equipment so that you have shelving and things like that. So a safe space to keep the packaging. And then they would come and give you product, the products that sell in the area. And then when you get an order, that person is obviously your home. You pack the order, and then someone comes and picks it up from your home and delivers it to people within your radius. And that way, you're able to have infrastructure to do that last mile delivery. So, really interesting models like that, where you are working around the constraints that you have, but building things that are actually solving the problems for the market. Those are the most interesting things that I saw.
While you were talking about those innovations and those experiences that works somewhere else than African countries and how we try to adapt them, I was wondering what was or what are the initiatives or the programs or the bridges that we could build between our countries. For example, you're in South Africa, I'm in Morocco. I'm sure you know some venture capitalists here in Morocco, and there is like experiences, case studies that we could share between ourselves and ideas. What do you think, and how do you see those? How do we see the possibilities of building those bridges?
There are so many things that could be done. Firstly, on the policy front, where governments just help reduce some of those trade barriers in between different African countries. I think somebody was talking a number. I think intra-Africa trade is at like 17% or something like that. That's very low. If we could just bump that up to 25%, 30%, can you imagine the impact we would have on the economies of different countries on the continent? So there are little initiatives that are already happening. Like, for example, Ghana has joined a few other countries to be completely visa free now to holders of African passports. So really just reducing friction around the movements of people by making entry into Ghana visa free for any African with an African passport. So in Cape Town, for example, Cape Town and the Western government, so the provincial government in Cape Town, is trying to establish bridges between Nigeria and Kenya, for example. So these are some of the big four markets, right? South Africa, Kenya, um, Nigeria, and Egypt. So the government of the Western Cape here in South Africa is trying to establish bridges between Kenya or Nairobi and Cape Town so that they can be a little bit of a visa-free agreement where founders in between the two cities can move back and forth with limited visa burdens as well. So these kinds of initiatives are happening, but they're smaller pockets. And the reason why I speak specifically to those things is because already in venture capital, we have these informal learning systems where we know the big four markets that you just mentioned. But usually what happens is that when there's a conference, say for example, right now there is the African Tech Summit in Nairobi, and a few other conferences will be happening in Nairobi in the next month. So then people go and congregate there. And then what happens while you're on the ground, you speak to investors on the ground, you learn from them, you ask to meet some of their portfolio companies, and vice versa. When people move and come to Cape Town towards the end of the year for the VC season here in Cape Town, that's what happens as well. So you already have formal systems of learning and knowledge exchange that are happening, and people are already moving around trying to find out, how can I reduce barriers to enter the market and things like that. But we need, of course, more policy work to support those initiatives to just reduce the barriers to trade. But these things are already
Wow,
happening.
amazing!
So,
I really like those examples that you gave us, and it represents also the challenges. Those are challenges for some entrepreneurs. So,
yeah,
but as we
yeah.
all know, challenges are parts of any journey, and as you said, you have faced challenges on your personal development or at the beginning of your journey, and but today, what would you say has been the biggest challenges that you have encountered as an entrepreneur, as a CEO, as a partner, and how did you overcome it?
The biggest challenge I think was managing people, because the biggest thing that I've seen, even as we're scaling Miss Adventure, is learning to speak the language of each person on the team and then being able to harness their best potential. Because sometimes, we're in situations where we're under time pressure and we need to deliver certain things. Say, for example, we have a credit committee meeting coming up, but there's also so much else going on, and people are being pulled in different directions because we're a small team. And being able to understand that this person is incredibly stressed and under pressure, how can I help them, but also not infringe on their autonomy to be able to figure this out themselves? I think the people problem is probably the most challenging thing, because at different stages of business, these problems arise in different ways. As you scale and have more team members, it becomes different versions of the same problem. And that's probably the one that we've had to deal with so far. The other one that we've had to deal with, probably because we are specifically funding women,
People
is
that
convincing people
we're not
that
using,
we're not
that
using,
taking a bet.
that taking a bet on making commercial return from female entrepreneurs is a rational decision. We speak to some people who, I'll give you an example. We were fundraising from a high net worth individual who runs a private equity fund, and his wife has a dental clinics practice. And we pitched him what we're doing and why it's so important to give access to female entrepreneurs to capital so they can grow and scale their business. And then he said to us, he said, no, but Egla, this is not a real problem because these women entrepreneurs just go to the bank. And then he said, my wife needed a new piece of equipment for her business. And then she went to the bank. And then they said no, but they asked her for her personal guarantee. And she gave a personal guarantee. And then I asked, okay, did she get the loan? And he said no. And then they asked me to put down my personal guarantee. And then they said yes. And then the question in my mind was, sir, this business has been running for years. It's profitable and is now at a place where it's ready to scale. But the bank did not believe that that was good enough to lend to the business. Your wife, who's incredibly qualified, has been running this business for years, put her personal guarantee down. That was not good enough until you came in with your high net worth person status. Then you were able to convince them to give capital to the business. This is the problem. So convincing people who are not directly impacted by this problem that it's a problem, it's quite a tough
Wow.
one.
Wow. So you said two things: managing people and convincing as a woman, as a female. entrepreneur or leader, a woman leader, a female leader,
Yeah.
that should find her space and place in the man's world in entrepreneurship in Africa, or maybe it's global. Uh, very, very interesting. And how did you do to face that?
Honestly, what we figured out now is that some people understand and others won't. And that's the quickest learning that we have to have because now, because I'm leading the fundraising initiative for the fund, now what I do is when someone just doesn't get it, you can see it's very quick to see that this person just doesn't understand what the problem is. Of course, now the decision is how much energy do I put in to try to convince them and bring them on board, versus where do I stop and decide, you know what, I'll come back to you maybe in a year or two once we have those numbers and the data to be able to prove to you that actually what we're saying is true. So it's a balance too of pushing until it makes sense to not push anymore. But with some people, interestingly, we've pushed and they've come back and been like, I didn't think this was a problem. I've done my personal research, I've introspected, and I cannot believe we don't talk about this more. And then they've come on
Oh,
board. Yeah.
amazing. I
Yeah.
was planning to ask you another question actually about women.
Yeah.
So we're
Yeah.
mostly at the end of our interview, and finally, for those young women and aspiring entrepreneurs um, that are trying to launch their businesses today in Africa, what advice would you offer to them as they start their own journeys in business?
Just go for it. Just go for it. Honestly, just go for it. We had been thinking about this event for 2 years before we took the jump and just did it. It's too long. This is what I always say. If you're trying to do something incredibly risky, personally risky, right? Say, for example, quitting a really steady job to start a business. Really think about what you're doing. Really think about what you're doing. Are you really passionate about this? Is this really a problem? Do your research. And once you have that research that it's really a problem, there's really a need for the solution, give yourself a year. In a year, have goals for yourself that by the end of the year, I want to achieve this, prove to myself that this is something worth pursuing. And after the year, if you find that it's not something worth pursuing, it was just a year. You go back to whatever you were doing before. If it works, in that year, just move your plan forward. So just do it.
Egla, thank you very much for sharing your incredible journey, experience, feedbacks, inspiring insights with us today. Your passion for empowering women and transforming Africa's business landscape is truly inspiring me and us. So it's been a great pleasure having you on the show today. Thank you again. Thank you for becoming a co-leader for Africa on this podcast. Thank you.
Thank you.
We did it. 30
We
minutes,
did
20,
it. We did it.
30 seconds. Okay, great. Woo.